Welcome to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's Arts webinar. I'm excited for today's topic, working with the Guidebook of Culturally Diverse Artists and Artworks. We will paste a link to the presentation slides into the chat for your convenience. I expect that our presentation today will take about 45 minutes, but this does depend on the number of audience questions we receive. Before we get started, I'd like to remind all attendees that this session is being recorded so that others may also have access to the content covered. Please feel free to use the chat box to engage with us and with one another during the session. I especially encourage you to leave any questions you may have in the chat. I will be sure to answer them either through the content of the presentation itself or in a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. My name is Dawn Bensky, the Arts Content Support Lead at DESE. I work on the Literacy and Humanities team at the Center for Instructional Support. As a lead writer of the guidebook, I am thrilled to be facilitating today's webinar for you. We will start with a session overview. Our session overview for today's webinar begins with our agenda, objectives, and an activator. Following this, I will provide a background for the guidebook, and then we will unpack its contents. We will then examine how the guidebook can be used to support culturally responsive teaching in the arts. And finally, we will have a brief wrap-up in which we conduct a Q&A, tell you about upcoming DESE arts opportunities, and ask you to complete a brief session feedback evaluation. Our objectives for today's webinar are to provide you with information about the purpose, background, and application of the Guidebook of Culturally Diverse Artists and Artworks. And from the perspective of working with the guidebook, we will also provide initial information about the 3 tenets, takeaways, and examples of culturally responsive teaching. I'd like to note that there will be additional DESE support around culturally responsive teaching in the arts as the upcoming school year unfolds. So please watch out for resources, opportunities, and support around culturally responsive teaching. First, a quick activator for you. We have some cultural responsiveness trivia here. Which of the following characteristics is a trait of a culturally responsive teacher? Is it socio-political cognizant? That's A. B, an affirming attitude towards students with different cultural backgrounds. C, committed to act as an agent of change. D, knowledgeable about the students and uses this knowledge to shape instruction and curriculum. E, holds constructivist views for learning. Or F, all of the above. Place the letter for your answer in the chat. I'll give everyone a moment to think about it. Place the letter for your answer in the chat. All right, if you guessed F for all of the above, you are correct. These are all characteristics of a culturally responsive teacher. We will talk more about culturally responsive teaching as we proceed through this presentation. Now I'd like to provide a brief background about the guidebook. Released in January of 2021, the Guidebook of Culturally Diverse Artists and Artworks is a baseline resource to support the implementation of a culturally responsive arts curriculum. We will place a direct link to the guidebook in the chat for your convenience. First, we must acknowledge that cultural responsiveness is a large and complex topic that extends far beyond the contents of any single resource. This resource supports cultural responsiveness with a very specific purpose: to promote and guide the study of racially diverse artists and their artworks in the curriculum. The guidebook was developed by a committee of arts educators and practicing artists who co-wrote the guidebook during the spring and early summer of 2020, which, considering the timeframe, was a very big feat. In addition to the writing team, DESE also enlisted many internal and external contributors and reviewers. The expertise of all of these dedicated individuals resulted in the inclusion of cases within the guidebook that either showcase a specific artist in a cultural context, especially in relation to systems of oppression, or cases of specifically compelling masterworks in the historical context of their creation. A particular feature of these cases is that the writers and reviewers paid special attention to providing an asset-based or positive lens to the cultural backgrounds represented. The committee selected cases that offer rich material for student learning and interests, with particular attention to contemporary work and local Massachusetts-based artist connections that can be made for students. The writing committee ensured that the 7 chosen case studies reflect the racial diversity of our Massachusetts students, especially those who have been historically underserved. The guidebook does several important things for teachers of the arts. First, it establishes a baseline for cultural responsiveness in the arts. In other words, although not an exhaustive resource, it provides a solid starting point for thinking and planning arts instruction in a culturally responsive way. The guidebook focuses on individuals and work that are specifically outside the European canon in order to highlight artists and artworks that are typically underrepresented in arts programs. Additionally, the guidebook provides case studies to make this practice tangible. The cases can be used in instruction directly from the resource, or teachers can use the cases as exemplars for the examination of other culturally diverse artists and works that may be relevant to their own curricula. It's important to understand that the guidebook aligns directly to the major changes and emphases of the 2019 Massachusetts Arts Curriculum Framework. Each case underscores the concept of artistic intent that is the driving mechanism for both the framework and general current thinking in arts education. It also instills habits of mind for planning around artistic practices and content standards via planning questions in each case study. Let's spend some time unpacking the components of the guidebook now. As we begin to unpack the content, I'd just like to remind you that you can place any questions you have in the chat box, and at the end of the webinar, I will leave time to answer them. So, quick reminder that the guidebook cannot do it all because culturally responsive teaching is complex. This guide focuses primarily on the study of racially diverse artists and artworks in the curriculum. That means it should not be considered exhaustive on the topic of cultural responsiveness. So what are the featured components of the guidebook? Well, it includes questions and linked resources to support cultural responsiveness, visual references and linked resources in each case study of artists and artworks, contextual information about each artist and artwork, planning questions focused on the 4 clusters: creating, presenting or performing, responding, and connecting. Suggested themes and student discussion questions to prompt prior knowledge, engage critical thinking, and personal connection making. And finally, suggested lesson starters within each case study indicate direct alignment to the content standards within the Massachusetts Arts Framework. Page 9 of the guidebook is especially important to become familiar with because it provides questions and resources for being culturally responsive. The chart on this page provides 2 categories of questions for arts educators. There are questions that generate educator self-reflection, and there are questions that support educator planning. Each section has linked resources that arts educators can follow to learn more. The question prompts for educator self-reflection are: what personal insights might help me to reflect upon prior to teaching students? It's pre-work. And then, what do I currently do? The question prompts for educator planning are: what will I teach and how will I teach it? Here are some examples. First, an educator reflects on their own experience, such as, what was your first experience with art that reflected your own culture and racial identity? How did you first respond to works of art that reflected another culture and racial identity? Then the questions lead an educator to consider what they are currently teaching, such as, how is your current arts curriculum representative of diverse cultures? How does your teaching engage students in learning about cultures other than their own? The chosen artists and artworks span across the 5 arts disciplines for each case study and represent the following racial groups: African American or Black, Latinx, Asian or Asian American, Native or Indigenous, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. It is important to note that these are broad racial categories, each representing numerous different geographies, cultures, styles, regional variations, and histories. The case studies featured in this resource are only a small sampling of these rich, varied cultural groups. For each case study, a description of the artist or artist's artwork's artistic intent is provided so that educators can make a direct connection when planning lessons that feature these artists or works, or other artworks of their own choosing. Artistic intent is the meaning the artist intended in a work, so far as it can be determined from the artist's statements or cultural context. Artistic intent can refer to a master artist or student artist. The concept is highlighted as guiding principle 2 and is a cornerstone throughout the entire 2019 Massachusetts Arts Curriculum Framework. As an example, here is the artistic intent described in case study 1. I'll give you a moment to read this, and I will summarize what is written. A summary of Jean Quick-to-See Smith's artistic intent is that she uses Native American symbols, words, maps, and landscapes to challenge viewer assumptions about Native American identities, histories, and cultures. Each case study has common planning questions that encourage habits of mind with the clusters of artistic practice: creating, presenting or performing, responding, and connecting. These planning questions are: how does the practice of creating with artistic intent feature within this work? How does this artist use presenting or performing to evoke, express, or communicate artistic intent? How does the artist and or the artist's audience respond to artistic or cultural concerns? And how does this art connect to an important larger context of knowledge and experience? These questions can be applied to any artist or artwork and therefore make them useful for planning beyond merely the 7 cases highlighted in the guidebook. The student discussion questions can be used directly or adapted to fit the needs of the arts curriculum. The discussion questions facilitate student critical thinking about artistic intent, issues of social justice, such as art as an agent of change, social conditions, heritage, immigration, or the methods of oppression, topics that can be seen in the examples I have listed here. And many of the guidebook discussion questions are designed to facilitate how students can use this thinking to develop their own artistic intent, as well as appreciating the artistic intent of artists and artworks that they study. Each case has a lesson starter with aligned content standards. These are meant to show one tangible way of incorporating the artist or artwork into the arts curriculum. The lesson starters are designed for specific grade levels. In case 3, for example, an assemblage sculpture project is designed for the pre-K through K grade levels, and the visual arts content standards addressed in the lesson are indicated below the project summary. The lesson starters can be modified for any grade level, though, and changed to the aligned content standards for that grade. DESE has come out with several supporting resources for culturally responsive teaching over the past few months. We will put a direct link in the chat that leads to the page on our website where you can learn more. We will spend the next few minutes providing a bird's eye view of these resources. I encourage you to follow the link to the website to have a more in-depth review of this content. At the end of this segment, we will specifically look at culturally responsive teaching examples through the lens of how the guidebook supports them. Let's examine the definition of cultural responsiveness. Cultural responsiveness is an approach to teaching that views a student's race, ethnicity, or linguistic ability as assets. This honors students' unique individual cultural affiliation and identity, thus ensuring trusting relationships with students. Since students already come to school with these assets, cultural responsiveness is an authentic way to harness the knowledge students already have in order to support their learning. Culturally responsive teaching happens in classrooms that foster and support students' diverse backgrounds, identities, strengths, and challenges. According to leading scholar Gloria Ladson-Billings, there are 3 tenets of culturally responsive teaching. The first tenet is academic achievement. This means that educators hold high, transparent expectations for all students and support the development of students' academic skills and identities as learners. Cultural competence means that educators understand culture's role in education, their students' cultures, and their own identity and biases, ultimately to affirm students' backgrounds and identities and foster their ability to understand and honor others' cultures. Sociopolitical awareness means that educators and students partner to identify, analyze, and work to solve systemic inequities in their communities and the world. So we have here 4 enduring understandings of culturally responsive teaching. First, culturally responsiveness is not an add-on. It is actually really just good teaching. A teacher's practice cannot be strong, effective, or rigorous unless it is culturally responsive. Now, to be sure, historically, neither DUSI nor our education system as a whole have positioned culturally responsive practice as essential to great teaching. So it is important to be clear that culturally responsive practice is not something educators do on the side, but is integrally woven into the concept of great teaching. All students need and deserve culturally responsive teaching. So a common misconception about culturally responsive teaching is that it is only for students who have been historically marginalized. But if we are to prepare and lead students to build a more just and equitable world, all students, including students with access to systems of power, need and deserve a culturally responsive education. Next, educators exist on a continuum of culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching is complex and varies based on the context and circumstances. An educator might demonstrate strength in culturally responsive teaching in some ways in a specific moment and demonstrate areas of growth in the next. The purpose of naming and focusing on culturally responsive teaching is not to reach a specific endpoint, but to strive for consistent and authentic teaching practices that embody and promote academic achievement, cultural competence, and socio-political awareness, our 3 tenets. Finally, educators must do a combination of adaptive and technical work to engage in culturally responsive teaching. They need to build technical skills, such as the ability to identify and support culturally responsive teaching. At the same time, educators can only teach in culturally responsive ways if they are also doing the adaptive work, such as engaging in ongoing learning and self-reflection to confront their own biases and racism and develop asset-based anti-racist mindsets. This is ongoing. It's continual work that we as educators must do in our work toward cultural responsiveness. So in the spirit of the enduring understanding that cultural responsive teaching is just good teaching, I've compiled some examples of good culturally responsive teaching that the guidebook directly supports. I will read them aloud for you. Use learning materials that represent and foster students' cultural identities. Help students understand how the content is relevant to their lives. Consider student interests and learning styles to plan diverse, developmentally appropriate tasks. Implement questions, tasks, and activities that are aligned to the grade level standards. Facilitate academic conversations that center student voice and leadership. So there's our student artistic intent. Use open-ended questioning to push student thinking toward learning targets. Ask higher order thinking questions to ensure students reach the learning target. So these are examples of good teaching that the guidebook supports. This list is not exhaustive, and if you'd like to see additional examples, please do visit the DESE webpage that we shared at the start of the segment. It provides a wealth of information for you and builds on this for sure. We will begin our wrap up now, which will include a Q&A, as promised, upcoming DESE arts opportunities, and a chance to provide some feedback about the webinar. At this time, I'd like to conduct the Q&A. So if you haven't already, please drop any questions into the chat. I'll take them in the order they've been asked. Please be aware that some questions may have been chatted to us privately as well. We will not identify who has asked any of today's questions, by the way, since this meeting is being recorded. I will stop screen sharing while we engage in Q&A. Stay tuned though, at the end of this Q&A, I will share some DESE arts opportunities with you. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And finally, I would like you to follow the link in the chat to provide us with your feedback about today's experience. It's really short. This little survey consists of 2 required multiple choice questions and 2 optional open response questions that you can share feedback with us about how this went for you and maybe what else you'd like to know in future opportunities. So go ahead and take the last few moments to make sure you can do that. And I know the link went into the chat. And while I have an opportunity, I just want to say a giant thank you for joining us today and hearing more about the Guidebook of Culturally Diverse Artists and Artworks. It was a big undertaking. I think it's a very good starting point for support. And if you have any additional questions or want to connect with me for anything related to arts education, Guidebook or other, here's my email, dawn.m.bensky@mass.gov. And I really thank you for participating today. I'm going to stop sharing screen now and end up saying one last thank you to everyone in person. And thank you, Grace, for putting my email there too. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your attendance and your contributions today.